Among history's most feared and controversial names, two men stand whose actions still haunt the pages of time: Isoroku Yamamoto and Friedrich Paulus. Let us begin with the first, Isoroku Yamamoto. Isoroku Yamamoto was born on the 4th of April in the year 1884 in the city of Nagaoka, nestled within Japan's Niigata prefecture. How did this quiet child of samurai heritage grow into one of the most enigmatic military minds of the 20th century? What inner turmoil haunted the man who launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, yet feared the war he helped ignite? Was he a patriot bound by duty or a strategist trapped by fate? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Yamamoto's origins were rooted in an age of transformation. Born as Isoroku Takano, his family name came from his samurai father, Sadayoshi Takano, who served the Nagaoka domain. Isoroku, meaning 56 in Japanese, reflected his father's age at the time of his birth. But in 1916, the boy would take on a new identity. Adopted by the Yamamoto family, another samurai household without an heir, he inherited not just their name but their legacy. From a young age, Yamamoto was immersed in tradition, discipline, and quiet resolve. The shifting currents of Meiji-era Japan shaped his worldview as the country rapidly transitioned from sword to steel, from feudal honor to imperial ambition. These tensions would form the bedrock of a life lived on the front lines of power and conflict. By the turn of the 20th century, Japan stood eager to prove itself on the world stage. And for young Isoroku Yamamoto, that meant trading tradition for torpedoes, stepping from a samurai lineage into the disciplined ranks of Japan's modern navy. In 1904, at just 20 years old, Yamamoto graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, placing 11th in his class. He had already begun shaping a mind known for precision and strategy. His baptism into naval warfare came quickly. That same year, Japan launched its campaign against Russia, a bold declaration from a rising power. Yamamoto was assigned to the armored cruiser Nisshin, one of the fleet's most vital ships. It was in the Battle of Tsushima during this very war that his resolve was tested in the crucible of combat. The Nisshin was repeatedly struck by Russian fire, and Yamamoto suffered a grievous injury, losing the index and middle fingers of his left hand. Yet instead of retreat, this wound marked the beginning of his legend. Among his fellow officers, the mutilated hand became a symbol of sacrifice and strength. He wore it not as shame, but as honor, a mark of having stared death in the face for emperor and empire. These early encounters with blood and fire forged a man who would shape the tides of future wars. The boy from Nagaoka was no longer merely a student, he was now a sailor of war. After the guns of the Russo-Japanese War fell silent, Isoroku Yamamoto's path took an unexpected turn, not deeper into Japan, but outward toward the world. In the year 1919, Yamamoto was selected to study at Harvard University in the United States. For a samurai-born naval officer, it was a cultural shock that would permanently reshape his thinking. Between the ivy-covered walls of Cambridge, he studied economics, observed industry, and absorbed the character of a nation that would one day become his fiercest adversary. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Yamamoto didn't view America with arrogance. He saw its immense industrial power, vast resources, and boundless ambition, and he respected it. Fluent in English, he traveled across the country, learning its customs, its politics, and its pulse. These were not idle observations, They became the foundations of his future warnings to Tokyo. His American experience deepened when he returned to Washington as a naval attaché. Stationed in the heart of American power, Yamamoto cultivated relationships, attended diplomatic functions, and kept his finger on the pulse of foreign military development. He was not a spy in the traditional sense, but he was a man collecting impressions that would one day guide strategies of life and death. From the halls of Harvard to the embassy in Washington, Yamamoto glimpsed a world far beyond Japan's shores. He returned home not just with knowledge, but with a quiet sense of foreboding. For he knew better than most, a war with the United States would not be short, and it would never be easy. Isoroku Yamamoto returned to Japan with a sharper mind and a broader vision. But the world he re-entered was shifting fast. Japan was expanding its military reach, and the push toward empire demanded decisive leaders. Yamamoto, ever disciplined and unshaken, climbed steadily through the ranks. In December of 1919, he was promoted to commander. Just 4 years later, he became captain. His early leadership roles were no ceremonial posting. He commanded the cruiser Isuzu in 1928, and soon after, the revolutionary aircraft carrier Akagi. These ships were not just symbols of power, they were laboratories of modern warfare. Yamamoto, already convinced of the future dominance of air power, began to push the limits of naval aviation. His vision was clear. The age of battleships was fading, and aircraft would determine the fate of empires. By the early 1930s, Yamamoto's insight earned him higher appointments. He became a rear admiral in 1929 and vice admiral by 1934. As Japan entered complex arms negotiations, he attended the London naval conferences, not just as an officer, but as a voice of reason in a nation leaning toward aggression. While his peers looked to military buildup and continental conquest, Yamamoto held a different view that Japan's strength lay not just in weapons, but in smart, strategic restraint. Still, as his reputation grew, so did the tension between him and Japan's rising militarist class. The admiral had climbed high, but the higher he rose, the more dangerous the air around him became. Long before the world grasped the power of planes, Isoroku Yamamoto saw the future written in the skies. While others clung to the grandeur of battleships, Yamamoto shifted his gaze upward to the roar of engines and the freedom of flight. In the early 1930s, he changed his naval specialty from gunnery to aviation, an unorthodox move that many questioned but few understood. For Yamamoto, it wasn't a gamble, it was foresight. As head of the aeronautics department, he fought fiercely for the advancement of carrier-based aviation. He saw aircraft carriers not as support vessels, but as floating arsenals capable of rewriting naval warfare. He advocated for new designs, longer ranges, and tactical innovations that often clashed with tradition-bound superiors. But Yamamoto was relentless. He wasn't just building planes, he was building a doctrine. His push also extended to land-based bombers like the Mitsubishi G3M and G4M aircraft with unprecedented range, specifically designed to carry torpedoes across vast distances. Though lightly armored and vulnerable, these planes symbolized Yamamoto's philosophy: strike fast, strike far, and control the air. This vision would culminate in the formation of Japan's first air fleet, a consolidated strike force that united the nation's largest aircraft carriers into a single lethal unit. It was a bold, unprecedented move, and when the time came, Yamamoto would unleash this fleet upon the world, not with hesitation, but with haunting precision. The admiral who once stared skyward in theory was now preparing for war in the air. As Japan drifted toward full-scale militarism, Isoroku Yamamoto found himself walking a dangerous line. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he opposed the nation's growing alliance with Germany and Italy, and he spoke out against it, even as the tripartite pact loomed. His resistance was not rooted in fear, but in realism. Yamamoto knew the power of the Western world firsthand, and he understood that a war with the United States would be neither swift nor winnable. His views, however, placed him directly at odds with the rising ultranationalists in Japan's government and army. The same clarity that earned him respect in naval circles now made him a marked man. Death threats poured in. His mail was filled with warnings. Many called him a traitor to the emperor, others simply vowed revenge. In a society where silence was safety, Yamamoto's words were dangerous. In private letters and quiet moments, Yamamoto accepted the threat. "A warrior's death," he wrote, "is always near." His calm response masked the storm around him. The army even assigned military police to guard him, a thin disguise for surveillance, perhaps even intimidation. To shield him, his allies took bold steps. In August of 1939, Yamamoto was reassigned from Tokyo to sea, appointed commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Officially, it was a promotion. In truth, it was exile for his protection, but the move gave him something else, full control of Japan's naval strategy. And soon, he would craft a plan that would shake the world awake. For all his doubts about war, Isoroku Yamamoto knew that if conflict with the United States was inevitable, it had to begin with a blow so devastating that it would force Washington to negotiate. That belief birthed one of history's most shocking military gambits, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In early 1941, Yamamoto drafted a plan that defied Japan's traditional naval strategy. It was bold, surgical, and reliant on secrecy. He believed that crippling America's Pacific Fleet could buy Japan 6 months of unchecked expansion. His strategy faced resistance from conservative naval leaders, but Yamamoto stood firm, even threatening to resign. Eventually, the operation was approved. The date was set Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. At dawn, 6 aircraft carriers launched over 300 planes toward the quiet American harbor in Hawaii. Within hours, battleships burned, airfields lay in ruin, and over 2,000 American lives were lost. Japan had struck first and struck hard. But the American aircraft carriers, Yamamoto's true targets, were not in port that day. Though hailed in Japan as a brilliant victory, Yamamoto felt no joy. In solemn tones, he reportedly warned, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The attack achieved tactical surprise, but it shattered diplomatic bridges and ignited a firestorm of vengeance. Yamamoto had rolled the dice and won the first hand. But he knew the game ahead would be far more dangerous. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japan surged across the Pacific with staggering speed. Under Yamamoto's naval command, the imperial forces swept through Southeast Asia, toppling Western colonial strongholds that had stood for generations. From the Philippines to Malaya, from Hong Kong to the Dutch East Indies, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Yamamoto's combined fleet became the spearhead of Japan's strategy. Carrier-based air power struck targets hundreds of miles apart. At sea, Japan's navy defeated Allied forces with alarming efficiency. In February of 1942, the British stronghold of Singapore fell. Days later, the Battle of the Java Sea further crippled Allied resistance in the region. Yamamoto's vision of mobile, fast-moving naval dominance was proving devastatingly effective. But beneath these triumphs, Yamamoto remained cautious. He knew the early victories were built on surprise and on enemies still reeling from the initial shock. He also knew that each island seized, each base expanded, stretched Japan's supply lines thinner. Time, as he had always warned, was not Japan's ally. Still, during these early months of 1942, the Japanese empire stood at its widest reach. Oil fields were secured, shipping lanes were dominated, morale soared. To the world, Yamamoto appeared as the architect of an invincible navy. But he understood the deeper truth: the longer the Americans were given to recover, the harder they would strike back. For now, Japan rode the wave of momentum, and Yamamoto remained at its crest, bracing for what would come next. Just as Japan basked in its string of victories, a sudden tremor shook its sense of invincibility. On April the 18th, 1942, barely 4 months after Pearl Harbor, American bombers launched from an aircraft carrier struck Tokyo in what would be known as the Doolittle Raid. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological blow was immense. For the first time, Japanese citizens felt the war on their own soil. And for Yamamoto, it was a wake-up call. He realized that American aircraft carriers were not just surviving, they were fighting back. The raid provided the leverage Yamamoto needed to push his next bold plan, an attack on Midway Atoll. His goal was not just territorial gain. He wanted to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into open battle and destroy their carriers once and for all. But this would not be another Pearl Harbor. This time, the Americans were watching. Yamamoto's plan was grand in scope, too grand, some argued. It involved splitting his fleet into several forces, attacking Midway, the Aleutian Islands, and setting submarine traps to intercept American reinforcements. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was complicated. Still, Yamamoto pressed forward. He believed that capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive line and buy the empire the time it desperately needed. He saw it as the decisive battle that could seal Japan's dominance. But what he didn't know was that American codebreakers had already deciphered the plan, and they were preparing a trap of their own. The Battle of Midway, fought in early June of 1942, was meant to be Yamamoto's masterpiece, a calculated strike to annihilate American naval power. Instead, it became one of the most stunning reversals in military history. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, U.S. codebreakers had uncovered Japan's full plan, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to set an ambush with his limited carrier force near Midway Atoll. As Yamamoto's forces advanced, the carefully orchestrated deception began to unravel. His carriers, commanded by Admiral Nagumo, were caught in a deadly moment of vulnerability, refueling and rearming aircraft when American dive bombers suddenly descended. In mere minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th, Hiryu, soon followed. Yamamoto, commanding from afar aboard the battleship Yamato, attempted to regroup his forces, but the advantage was gone. His surface fleet was too scattered to retaliate, and American carriers quickly withdrew, avoiding further confrontation. Yamamoto was forced to order a retreat. Midway was more than a tactical loss. It was a spiritual blow to the Japanese Navy. 4 elite carriers, hundreds of seasoned pilots, and irreplaceable aircraft were gone. The aura of Japanese invincibility at sea had vanished. Though Yamamoto was not directly blamed, the sting of failure hung over him. The man who once dreamed of swift victory now faced the long, grinding war he had always feared. Midway marked the turning point. The Pacific tide had begun to shift. In the aftermath of Midway, Yamamoto knew Japan could no longer afford to play offense without cost. Yet the war pressed on, and its next brutal chapter unfolded in the Solomon Islands. Determined to protect Japan's southern flank and threaten Allied supply routes to Australia, Yamamoto committed his battered navy to a prolonged campaign around Guadalcanal. The stakes were enormous. Whoever controlled the Solomons would hold the gateway between the Pacific and the Coral Sea. Yamamoto coordinated multiple naval operations to support ground troops, disrupt American landings, and challenge the rising tide of U.S. reinforcements. But what began as a calculated series of engagements soon devolved into exhausting attritional warfare. The battles were fierce, chaotic, and often fought at night, a tactic favored by the Japanese. Naval clashes such as Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and Tassafaronga showcased both brilliance and desperation. Japanese forces inflicted serious damage, but victory proved elusive. Each success cost Yamamoto ships, fuel, and seasoned sailors he could not replace. Carrier battles at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz added to the toll. Though the Japanese fleet struck hard, the Americans showed increasing resilience, their tactics sharpening, their industrial might now fully awake. Yamamoto found himself locked in a struggle he could not escape, directing a fleet that was slowly bleeding from 1,000 cuts. For the first time, Yamamoto's command no longer brought dominance, it brought survival. The Solomons became a graveyard of potential, and the Admiral who once ruled the waves found himself boxed into a defensive war he had tried so hard to prevent. By early 1943, the brilliance of Japan's early conquests had dimmed into a grueling defense. Admiral Yamamoto watched as the empire he helped expand began to crumble under the weight of sustained losses and strategic overreach. The Solomons campaign had drained Japan's fleet, and American pressure was mounting across every front. Battles were no longer swift and decisive. They were slow, costly, and unwinnable. Japan's vaunted navy, once the pride of the Pacific, was now struggling to hold position. Supplies were dwindling, aircraft carriers were scarce, and fuel shortages crippled mobility. Worse still, Japan's pool of trained pilots, the pride of Yamamoto's air strategy, was being depleted faster than they could be replaced. Attrition became the empire's greatest enemy. Yamamoto remained at the helm, but the shadow of Midway followed him. His critics grew bolder, and trust within the naval general staff began to falter. Yet he pressed on, leading from the front, issuing orders with conviction and refusing to surrender even an inch of ground without resistance. Despite his efforts, morale within the fleet eroded. Japan's soldiers and sailors, once filled with confidence and patriotic fervor, now faced exhaustion, starvation, and doubt. The decisive victory Yamamoto once dreamed of had vanished. He had warned that Japan had only a short window to win the war. Now that window had closed, and the walls were beginning to shake. The empire he once helped command was no longer expanding. It was shrinking and fast. In the spring of 1943, Isoroku Yamamoto planned a morale-boosting tour across frontline bases in the South Pacific. He intended to visit troops, inspect airfields, and reassure a navy fraying at the edges. The trip was meant to inspire. Instead, it became his death sentence. Unknown to Yamamoto, American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes, and his itinerary was now in enemy hands. The decrypted message revealed precise times, locations, and flight paths. It was an opportunity too great to ignore. On April the 17th, Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized a secret mission, codenamed Operation Vengeance, to intercept and eliminate Japan's most valuable strategist. A squadron of American P-38 Lightning fighters was chosen for the task, as they alone had the range to reach Yamamoto's flight path near Bougainville Island. On the morning of April the 18th, Yamamoto boarded his Mitsubishi G-4M bomber at Rabaul. Despite warnings of a possible ambush, he insisted the journey go ahead, determined to keep his promise to the troops. Midway through the flight, his plane was intercepted. A short, brutal dogfight erupted in the skies. Yamamoto's aircraft spiraled into the jungle, trailing smoke. Japanese search parties later found his body, still strapped in his seat, hand on his katana, face calm in death. The admiral who had once commanded fleets across oceans had fallen from the sky in silence. His passing was hidden from the Japanese public at first, but among his officers, the grief was immediate and immense. News of Yamamoto's death shook the Imperial Navy to its core. Although the Japanese government initially concealed the truth, whispers traveled quickly through the ranks. When the announcement was finally made public, it struck like a thunderclap. The man who had shaped Japan's naval destiny and warned of the storm ahead was gone. The response was immediate and ceremonial. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to the rank of Marshal Admiral, a rare and final honor reserved for Japan's most revered military figures. He was also awarded the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Chrysanthemum, the highest possible decoration in the empire. His ashes were returned to Japan aboard the massive battleship Musashi, his last flagship. On June the 5th, 1943, Yamamoto was given a full state funeral in Tokyo. Soldiers wept, citizens bowed in silence, and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was photographed solemnly bowing before the admiral's portrait. Part of Yamamoto's ashes were interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, while the rest were laid to rest at his ancestral temple in Nagayaka, where his journey had first begun. Among his fellow officers, Yamamoto was remembered not only as a brilliant strategist, but as a man of honor, loyalty, and humility. His loss created a vacuum in leadership that was never truly filled. Though the war would rage on for 2 more years, many inside Japan understood, with Yamamoto's death, a chapter had closed, and with it, the last clear voice of caution had been silenced. Isoroku Yamamoto was more than an admiral. He was a man of deep contradiction. He lived in a nation that glorified war, yet he warned of its dangers. He commanded the fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor, yet doubted Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged fight. Those who knew him described a man both precise and philosophical, driven by duty but burdened by foresight. Beyond the battlefield, Yamamoto was known for his love of calligraphy, poetry, and games of strategy, especially Go, bridge, and poker. He often joked about retiring to Monaco to open a casino. He had a warm wit, a sharp intellect, and a calm presence that disarmed even his fiercest rivals. But his personal life was not without complication. His wife Rieko once revealed that Yamamoto had grown emotionally closer to his favorite geisha than to her, a detail that caused waves of public reflection years after his death. He formed enduring friendships, especially with Admiral Takechi Hori, a fellow naval officer who had once been purged for his pacifist views. Yamamoto's letters to Hori reveal a man who wrestled with the morality of his mission and the future of Japan. On the 18th of April in the year 1943, Isoroku Yamamoto's plane was ambushed over Bougainville by American fighters, and he was killed instantly. The attack was carried out under Operation Vengeance, a daring mission that had been authorized by President Roosevelt himself after U.S. intelligence cracked Japanese codes revealing Yamamoto's travel route. His death stunned the Japanese public and marked a symbolic blow to Japan's naval command. In popular memory, Yamamoto's image remains complex. To some, he is the architect of Pearl Harbor, the face of Japan's military aggression. To others, he is the reluctant warrior, a strategist who understood that Japan was walking into a war it could not win. In film, books, and documentaries, his legacy lives on. His name evokes discipline, brilliance, and tragic foresight. Even today, historians debate whether Yamamoto was a loyal servant of empire or its most prophetic warning. In either case, his life casts a long shadow, not only across Japan's past, but across the very nature of power, responsibility, and the cost of war. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Friedrich Paulus was born on the 23rd of September in the year 1890 in Breitenau, a small town nestled in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, part of the German Empire. How did a quiet boy from a modest background rise to command one of the largest armies in military history? What inner conflict did he endure while serving a dictator he did not fully trust? And what led him to become the first German field marshal to surrender in defiance of a deadly tradition? Friedrich Paulus's early years were marked by humble beginnings. He was the son of a schoolteacher, and though he bore no noble title or fortune, he showed a deep fascination with order, structure, and service. He originally dreamed of joining the Navy, but his modest social standing closed that path. Instead, he enrolled in the German Imperial Army in 1910, just before the Great War erupted across Europe. During World War I, Paulus served as a junior officer. Though he was not known for battlefield heroics, he developed a reputation for discipline, efficiency, and keen organizational skill, qualities that would later define his rise. After the war, as Germany reeled from defeat and political unrest, Paulus remained in the restructured Reichswehr, quietly climbing the ranks. His sharp mind and methodical approach to strategy earned him respect among superiors, though he often stood in the shadow of more flamboyant commanders. Yet even in these quiet beginnings, the seeds of history were being sown in a man destined to face impossible decisions on the bloodiest stage of modern war. In the years leading up to the First World War, Friedrich Paulus found his calling in the rigid structure of Germany's military institutions. After enlisting in 1910, he received training at the Officers' Academy and was assigned to the 111th Infantry Regiment. His early service emphasized precision, discipline, and obedience, virtues that matched his temperament perfectly. He was not known for daring bravery, but for his quiet reliability and careful planning. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Paulus entered the conflict as a junior officer. He was deployed to the Western Front, where trench warfare and staggering casualties defined the brutal new era of combat. Though he was wounded once, his service remained largely administrative and strategic. Rather than leading charges across no man's land, Paulus worked behind the lines, learning the complexities of supply lines, troop coordination, and operational logistics. This experience proved formative. While other officers focused on heroism in battle, Paulus absorbed the larger mechanics of war, how battles were won not only by courage but by calculation. His calm under pressure and attention to detail earned him steady promotions. He finished the war as a captain, respected if not celebrated. For Paulus, the war was both an education and a warning. He witnessed firsthand the cost of poor planning and blind ambition. These early lessons shaped the cautious strategist he would later become, a man who valued order over glory, and who would one day be asked to lead in a war even more devastating than the first. With the Treaty of Versailles in place, Germany's once mighty military was dismantled, reduced to a skeleton force called the Reichswehr. In this constrained environment, Friedrich Paulus quietly continued his career, navigating a system designed to weed out all but the most loyal and efficient officers. Despite his modest background and lack of frontline glory, Paulus rose steadily, not through charisma, but through competence. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Paulus served in a variety of staff roles, particularly within training and logistics divisions. he gained recognition for his meticulous work ethic and his talent for operational planning. In a military that prized loyalty and obedience, his calm demeanor and analytical skills made him a dependable figure. While he lacked the dramatic flair of more political officers, he earned the trust of his superiors by delivering consistent results. It was during this period that Paulus caught the attention of rising figures in the new German military order. As the Nazi Party gained power and the Reichswehr transitioned into the larger Wehrmacht, Paulus adapted, not out of ideology, but from professional discipline. He did not join the Nazi Party, nor did he speak out against it. Instead, he remained focused on his duties, embodying the silent professionalism that marked many of Germany's career officers. By the late 1930s, Paulus had earned a promotion to the General Staff. He was appointed Chief of Staff for Panzer Forces, working closely with the architects of Germany's new strategy of rapid, mechanized warfare. Though not yet famous, Paulus was now firmly on the path to high command. History was shifting, and the quiet planner from Hesse was rising with it. As Germany rearmed in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, Friedrich Paulus stepped deeper into the heart of military planning. His reputation for structure, detail, and disciplined thought earned him increasingly critical roles within the General Staff. By 1939, he was appointed Deputy Chief of the Operations Department, a pivotal post as Europe braced for a second major conflict. Paulus worked under General Franz Halder, helping plan the early stages of World War II. Though not involved in frontline decisions, he played an essential part in shaping operational frameworks for the invasions of Poland and France. While other officers chased battlefield glory, Paulus worked behind the scenes, refining logistics, calculating movement timetables, and coordinating strategic responses. His work in the development of blitzkrieg tactics, especially in organizing armored formations and ensuring coordination between tanks and infantry, brought him closer to the center of German military thought. Though not a tank commander himself, he understood the principles well enough to earn the respect of seasoned field generals. Still, some questioned his suitability for combat leadership, calling him too cautious and analytical for fast-moving battlefields. In 1940, Paulus was promoted to lieutenant general. His growing visibility within the Wehrmacht made him a trusted figure among top commanders, including Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. But his greatest career shift was still ahead. In the shadows of high command, a new campaign was taking shape, a vast and ambitious invasion to the east. And Friedrich Paulus, long the strategist behind others' triumphs, was about to be thrust onto the world stage in a command that would define his legacy. By the early 1940s, Friedrich Paulus's consistent performance and strategic skill had not gone unnoticed. His reserved nature, paired with an unwavering dedication to duty, appealed to Adolf Hitler, who increasingly valued loyalty over battlefield flair. Though Paulus was not a Nazi Party member, his steady rise through the ranks and reliability placed him in proximity to the upper circles of power. In 1941, as Hitler prepared for the largest military invasion in history, the campaign against the Soviet Union, Paulus was entrusted with one of the most critical staff roles, planning and organizing Operation Barbarossa. He helped coordinate the deployment of millions of troops, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Though he remained behind the lines, his fingerprints were all over the initial German advance. His clear reports and methodical approach impressed Hitler, who preferred subordinates that followed orders without challenge. That same year, despite his limited field experience, Paulus was appointed deputy commander of the German 6th Army, a prestigious unit with a reputation for toughness. It was a surprising appointment to many, but Hitler believed Paulus's discipline and staff expertise could be transformed into battlefield command. By early 1942, with war deep in the Russian steppe, Hitler made a fateful decision. He placed Friedrich Paulus in full command of the Sixth Army. The appointment stunned the officer corps. The quiet strategist had become a frontline general, and his first major test would soon come in a place called Stalingrad. Long before the German Sixth Army approached Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus had been immersed in the grand design of Hitler's Eastern ambitions. As early as late 1940, detailed plans for a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union began taking shape within the German High Command. Paulus, then a senior staff officer, was tasked with helping coordinate the logistics and scope of what would become Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. Paulus's role was not ideological. He did not advocate for the war against Russia, nor did he show enthusiasm for Nazi doctrine. Rather, he approached the assignment like a massive puzzle, one that required meticulous timing, coordination, and calculation. He mapped routes, scheduled divisions, and calculated supply demands with cold precision. For a planner like Paulus, the challenge was monumental, but intellectually compelling. When the invasion launched on June the 22nd, 1941, Paulus watched from his desk as over 3 million German soldiers stormed eastward across thousands of miles. The initial success was breathtaking. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, cities fell rapidly, and German troops pushed ever deeper into Russian territory. Yet Paulus also saw the risks: the stretching of supply lines, the underestimation of Soviet reserves, and the overconfidence in a quick victory. As the summer turned to autumn and the German advance began to slow, Paulus understood what few dared to admit: the Eastern campaign would not be short nor simple. But in Hitler's eyes, Paulus's clear thinking and loyalty remained valuable. And by the following year, he would no longer be behind the scenes. He would be on the front lines, sent to lead an army at the very heart of the Eastern War. In January of 1942, Friedrich Paulus assumed full command of the German Sixth Army. It was his first frontline command, and it came during one of the most ambitious campaigns of the war, Hitler's push toward southern Russia and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Sixth Army, already a seasoned and respected force, was assigned to seize a strategic city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. Paulus approached his new role with characteristic caution and discipline. He relied heavily on planning and coordination, trusting his staff officers and seeking to avoid reckless decisions. But the Eastern Front was not a place for theory. It demanded instinct, boldness, and speed, qualities Paulus lacked. Still, he pressed forward, following Hitler's orders to advance through brutal terrain and worsening conditions. By August of 1942, the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Soviet resistance was fierce. The Red Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, turned the city into a fortress. Street by street, building by building, the battle escalated into a grinding war of attrition. The Germans captured much of the city, but Paulus's forces were stretched thin. Supplies ran low, casualties mounted, and morale wavered. Despite the bloodshed, Paulus continued to believe that a final push could break Soviet resistance. He remained loyal to his orders and confident in German superiority. But what he could not see, and what his enemies were preparing, would soon trap him in one of the most devastating military reversals of the century. The battle for Stalingrad was only beginning, and the cost would be unimaginable. As the summer of 1942 gave way to autumn, the battle for Stalingrad descended into a living nightmare. For Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army, the city became a maze of rubble, sniper fire, and hand-to-hand combat. German tanks were useless in the narrow alleys, and every advance was met with savage Soviet resistance. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. It was no longer a campaign. It was a slow, grinding death trap. Paulus, ever methodical, continued to issue precise orders, but his headquarters was often out of touch with the chaos on the ground. Communication lines were strained, supply chains broken, and field commanders forced to improvise in brutal conditions. Temperatures plummeted. Ammunition and rations dwindled. Wounded soldiers froze to death before they could be evacuated. Still, Paulus pressed on. Hitler had declared that the city must be taken at any cost. The symbolic weight of capturing Stalingrad, the city bearing Stalin's name, had overtaken all strategic logic. Paulus, bound by obedience, obeyed. Even as his officers urged tactical withdrawals, he refused, fearing the consequences of defying orders. Inside the city, German soldiers began calling the urban ruins the meat grinder. Fatigue and despair spread through the ranks. Still, Paulus remained calm, committed to his duty. Yet behind Soviet lines, massive reinforcements were gathering. A trap was being set. And soon, the Sixth Army, once Germany's pride, would find itself not as a victor, but as prey. On November the 19th, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that changed the course of the war. Soviet forces, striking from the north and south of Stalingrad, bypassed the city and targeted the weaker Romanian and Hungarian divisions guarding Paulus's flanks. Within days, the trap was sprung. The pincers met west of the city, and the entire German Sixth Army, more than 200,000 men, was encircled. Paulus was stunned. He had received intelligence of Soviet buildups, but Hitler had insisted the Soviets were too weak to launch a major offensive. Now, the Sixth Army was cut off, trapped inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad with dwindling supplies and no way out. Hitler forbade any breakout attempts. He promised an airlift would supply the army until relief arrived, but the Luftwaffe could deliver barely a fraction of what was needed. Inside the pocket, known as the Kessel or cauldron, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Soldiers froze in their trenches. Horses were slaughtered for food. Ammunition ran low. Wounded men died without morphine. Still, Paulus followed orders. He organized defensive perimeters, rationed supplies, and waited for a rescue that never came. On December the 12th, a German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, tried to break through the Soviet lines. It failed. The ring tightened. Communication with the outside world became erratic. And still, Hitler ordered Paulus to hold the city to the last man and the last bullet. For Paulus, the strategist who had once mapped out invasions from a desk, it was now a test of endurance, loyalty, and survival. The walls were closing in, and his choices were narrowing with every passing day. Trapped inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus faced the most agonizing chapter of his military life. The encircled Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and rapidly disintegrating. Morale collapsed as the weeks dragged on. Thousands perished from cold, hunger, or untreated wounds. And yet Hitler's orders remained unchanged: no surrender, no retreat. Stalingrad must be held, the Führer insisted. The army must fight to the last man. Paulus, a man of order and obedience, obeyed at first. He believed in discipline and had never questioned his superiors. But as conditions worsened and hope faded, doubt crept in. His generals begged him to act independently, to break out or to defy Berlin and save what remained of the army. But Paulus hesitated. He feared the consequences, not just for himself, but for his men, his family, and the honor-bound oath he had sworn. Throughout December and January, Paulus remained in his headquarters at the Univermag department store, issuing commands to troops that no longer had the strength or supplies to carry them out. Reports arrived daily, frostbite cases in the thousands, ammunition nearly gone, rations cut to starvation levels. Even so, Hitler's messages grew harsher, insisting that capitulation would be shameful and that victory was still possible. By late January of 1943, the Soviets had crushed all organized resistance outside the city center. Paulus's command zone had shrunk to a few square blocks. His hands trembled not from fear but from cold and helplessness. He had followed every order, held every line, and now he was leading an army to its death. Something had to break, and soon it would. On January the 31st, 1943, silence fell over the ruins of central Stalingrad. After months of relentless siege, starvation, and bloodshed, Friedrich Paulus made a decision that shocked the world. He surrendered. The commander of the once proud German Sixth Army became the first German field marshal in history to be captured alive. Until that moment, no one of his rank had ever allowed himself to fall into enemy hands. Hitler had expected Paulus to fight to the death or take his own life. But Paulus had reached his breaking point. His soldiers were dying by the thousands, reduced to eating scraps and melting snow for water. Ammunition had run out. Medical supplies were gone. Resistance had collapsed into scattered skirmishes. He could no longer justify the slaughter. Despite Hitler's direct command never to surrender, Paulus laid down arms. The news spread like wildfire. In Germany, it was received with disbelief and horror. Hitler raged that Paulus lacked honor, calling him weak. In Soviet circles, the capture was celebrated as a turning point. For Paulus, it was both a release and a burden. He had preserved what lives he could, but he knew he would never return to the army or perhaps even his homeland. The surrender at Stalingrad marked a turning tide in World War II. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and exposed the limits of blind obedience. For Paulus, it ended his battlefield career, but began a very different journey, one of captivity, reflection, and historical reckoning. After his surrender at Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus was taken into Soviet custody, not as a typical prisoner of war, but as a prize. He was transported under heavy guard to Moscow, where he was interrogated, observed, and studied. Unlike many of his captured officers who were sent to brutal labor camps, Paulus was held in relative isolation, granted modest comfort and time to think. It was during this period that his transformation began. At first, Paulus remained withdrawn and loyal to the oath he had sworn. He refused to denounce Hitler or the German military leadership. But as months turned into years, and the horrors of the Nazi regime were revealed more fully, especially the Holocaust and the systematic extermination of civilians, something shifted in him. His conversations with fellow officers, Soviet handlers, and other captured generals slowly chipped away at his silence. He was eventually moved to a villa near Moscow, where he lived under surveillance but with access to books, news, and limited communication. Unlike other Nazi leaders, Paulus had never been deeply ideological. Now, faced with time and undeniable truth, he began to see Hitler not as a flawed leader, but as a destroyer of Germany's soul. His health remained fragile. He suffered from anxiety, guilt, and persistent illness. Yet through it all, he remained composed, studying, writing, and questioning everything he had once accepted without hesitation. The man who had helped orchestrate a colossal war was now its captive, not only behind Soviet walls, but inside his own haunted conscience. In captivity, Friedrich Paulus underwent a transformation that would have once seemed unthinkable. By 1944, he began cooperating with Soviet-backed anti-Nazi efforts. He became a founding member of the National Committee for a Free Germany, a propaganda initiative made up of German prisoners of war who publicly condemned Hitler and called on German soldiers to surrender. Though many Germans saw this as betrayal, for Paulus, it was a deeply conflicted act of conscience. He had spent most of his career following orders, upholding military discipline and avoiding politics. But the catastrophe at Stalingrad, followed by the revelations of Nazi atrocities, had broken that silence. He now believed it was his duty to speak out, not for revenge or survival, but for the future of Germany. In broadcasts and written statements, Paulus urged his former comrades to abandon a lost war and reject Hitler's suicidal commands. He appeared as a solemn, serious figure, not defiant but burdened. His voice carried the weight of failure, regret, and moral awakening. For the Soviets, he was a useful symbol, a high-ranking defector who validated their cause. But for many Germans, especially those still loyal to the regime, Paulus became a hated figure, seen as a traitor who turned on his own people. Yet Paulus did not seek sympathy. He rarely spoke of his personal suffering. His statements focused instead on responsibility, on the blindness of military obedience, the danger of unchecked power, and the need to rebuild Germany not with hate, but with truth. In the end, he was no longer just a general, he had become a voice of warning. In 1953, more than a decade after his capture at Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus was finally allowed to leave Soviet territory. But he did not return to his native Hesse in West Germany. Instead, he settled in Dresden, located in East Germany, then under Soviet control. Though technically free, Paulus remained under close observation and was given limited public roles by East German authorities. His life after repatriation was quiet and introspective. He lived modestly in a state-provided apartment, surrounded by books, memories, and silence. In the divided post-war Germany, his name remained polarizing. In West Germany, many viewed him as a traitor for cooperating with Soviet propaganda. In East Germany, he was treated cautiously, a symbolic figure of German guilt, but not one widely celebrated. Paulus declined opportunities to re-enter politics or military life. Instead, he focused on writing and occasional commentary about military history and strategy. He never fully defended his wartime actions, but he also never shifted blame. When questioned, he spoke of duty, conscience, and the danger of blind obedience. He occasionally received visitors, historians, former officers, and curious journalists. Some came seeking confession, others sought condemnation. Paulus offered neither. He had become a man defined not by his rise, but by his collapse and his effort to understand it. His later years were marked by frailty, reflection, and a quiet desire to be forgotten. But history had other plans. His name remained tied forever to one of the most tragic battles in modern warfare, and to the moral cost of simply following orders. Friedrich Paulus spent his final years in Dresden, far from the public eye and the halls of power he once walked. His health steadily declined throughout the late 1950s. The burden of command, the weight of moral compromise, and the years of captivity had aged him beyond his years. He rarely appeared in public and spoke even less. But in those quiet final chapters, Paulus remained a figure of haunting symbolism, not only in Germany, but across the world. On the 1st of February in the year 1957, exactly 14 years after his surrender at Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden at the age of 66. His passing was noted in East German media with restrained commentary. In the West, it reignited debates about duty, honor, and the ethics of war. Some remembered him as the architect of one of the greatest military disasters of all time. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man trapped by duty, destroyed by obedience, and redeemed only by belated moral clarity. His death, much like his life, did not offer easy conclusions. In the decades that followed, historians revisited his legacy with growing nuance. He was neither a hero nor a monster, but something far more human, a career soldier whose rise and fall mirrored the fate of the regime he served. His surrender at Stalingrad became a defining moment not just in the war, but in the moral history of the 20th century. To this day, Friedrich Paulus remains a subject of study, criticism, and reflection. His name is etched into the tragic lesson of Stalingrad, a lesson about the cost of rigid loyalty, the limits of military discipline, and the quiet, painful evolution of a man who saw too much, spoke too late, and lived long enough to regret it all. His story stands as a final warning from within history itself. That silence, even when wrapped in uniform, can shape the destiny of nations. What do you think about Isoroku Yamamoto? Was Yamamoto a visionary admiral, a master of strategy who foresaw the dangers of war with the West and tried to protect his nation through precision and calculated boldness? Or a conflicted commander, bound by duty, haunted by Pearl Harbor, and ultimately consumed by the very conflict he hoped to prevent? And what about Friedrich Paulus? Was Paulus a disciplined officer, a loyal servant of the German army who faced impossible decisions with composure and quiet responsibility? Or a tragic symbol of blind obedience, a man who followed orders into catastrophe, then spent the rest of his life reckoning with silence, surrender, and shame? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these men noble patriots caught in the storm of war, or reflections of systems that demanded silence over soul? Did they lead with wisdom and restraint, or were they merely instruments of empires spiraling toward destruction? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.